If you're ever going to have kids, you need to watch this video about childhood trauma. If you're new here, I'm Jith. I'm a biomedical science graduate who graduated from the University of Technology, Sydney. And I also run a company that educates and mentors young children from as early as 4 years old, all the way up to 19 years old. And through the last 5 years of teaching students and also working alongside other highly qualified educators, I've come to learn how different students are wired, and I've kind of seen how different students can be wired in different ways and how this impacts their learning and how this impacts their development as children and young adults. I've also noticed that there has been a growing trend of mental illness, not just in the students that I teach, but also in people around my age, in their early 20s and even going into close to 30. I was vaguely interested in psychology in the past, but it wasn't until someone very close to me was diagnosed with a mental illness that I started to look into some of these topics a lot deeper, because through them, I saw how difficult it was to live with a mental illness. And it got me thinking, what causes mental illness and what could be done to help? I've probably spent hundreds of hours researching online and listening to podcasts from professors to get as much information as I can about ADHD, about anxiety, about borderline personality disorder, about NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, all to understand just what is causing this and why am I noticing just higher levels of these conditions around me, not just in young adults but also in the students that I teach. I also want to say that nothing in this video is to speak ill about people with mental illness. In most cases, people with mental illness never really chose to be that way. They were victims of something that happened to them oftentimes in early childhood. And the reasons for getting mentally ill and the things that might trigger mental illness, they're not really that well known. Like, no matter which expert you ask, there's so much limitations and there's so much missing from the literature that people just haven't had the chance to research and understand. We're still really just getting to know all these different illnesses because until very recently, people never really, thought of mental illness as a real thing. It wasn't until probably the last 50 years, 60 years that people started to treat mental illness a lot more seriously. I don't want to stigmatize anyone who has a mental illness. Instead, I'm going to deep dive into how childhood can affect someone's personal development and shed some light on maybe why we're experiencing an epidemic of mental illness here in the West. There's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of stigma around people who suffer from mental illness even now. Like, through my research, I've just seen so much talked about in online forums, and it's not always the most positive things. In fact, a lot of it was very negative. And although I don't actually suffer from any of these conditions myself, I understand that these are just people and they never really asked to be this way. Like, a lot of these people who have developed mental illnesses, personality disorders and things, they have become like that because they are actually victims of something that maybe has happened in their childhood. And we should really approach these people who have these conditions with empathy because they are people. Like, although they might not behave in ways that are exactly what people expect, they still deserve to have empathy and to live like happy and fulfilling lives. And part of this video that I'm making is just so that people can kind of understand this more openly, and we can have like an open discussion about these things and just make it more normal to talk about. The way to empathize with some people who suffer from certain mental health conditions is to, let's say, imagine that you are annoyed at somebody and you kind of know what mild annoyance feels like, but imagine that you had that annoyance turned up by a factor of 10 times what you normally feel. Then you'd understand how overwhelming that can be, and that's how some people with cluster B personality disorders see the world, or how they feel. So it's really not something to take personally. And in the same way, someone with anxiety, they would also feel anxiety at 10 times or like just a higher level than what normal people would feel. So imagine, you're anxious to go give a speech. Let's say you're thinking back to high school, you're thinking just like some job or something that you have to do where you have to give a speech or talk in front of some people. So you feel anxious, a little bit nervous, but imagine that times 10. And that's what somebody with anxiety feels. And for normal people, it's really hard to understand that. I don't think anyone who's neurotypical can truly understand just how painful and how difficult it can be to live with a mental illness. And I just want to just clarify, I don't have any of these things, but I've just, through my research, I've just heard things from both sides. People who don't have mental illness, people who do have a mental illness, and just how their experiences can differ. And everyone's experiences of life differs because everyone's slightly different. They're wired differently. So moving on to attachment issues and child development, the increase in mental illness and personality disorders in society is a multivariable issue, and each case is unique. It's very easy to try and reduce something to one cause because the causes are usually very complicated and hard for even professors to really break down and understand when it comes to mental illness. But most experts agree that our childhood is usually where the root of most of the mental illness lies. The first 3 years of a child's life is really what sets them up for their mental health for the rest of their life. If they don't experience stability, if they don't experience care and empathy during this time, then they'll feel things now that they'll feel probably 20 years from now. If someone is 2 years old and they have like abandonment issues, then because of the way that their mom or their dad is treating them, then studies have shown that in 20 years, 30 years time, they still carry that with them and they still are affected by that. So it's just super important that people and children are looked after in that critical 0 to 3 year period. This is why as parents, or as future parents one day, if you want to have kids one day, that is, that it's so important to be physically and emotionally there for your children, especially in this very critical time of their development. Because when a child is born, they need you to help with their distress. If a child is born and they're, let's say, neglected by their parents, let's say that when they're in distress, no one comes to soothe them, then what that child develops is stress. And they develop these very deeply ingrained stress responses, which then lead to things like cluster B personality disorders, which can then lead to things like anxiety, because it's all stress related. And you have to know that compared to other animals, humans are so different. Our babies are born so underdeveloped because of our large brains and because of our large skulls. If human babies were born as mature as other mammals, then women wouldn't be able to have children. Like, it's just going to be impossible for them to have children, or they'll die in childbirth. So as an evolutionary tactic, our ancestors' bodies have adapted, and our bodies have adapted to have kids very premature. And because they're born so prematurely, they need even more attention from their mother or father. Without getting this attention at a young age and this care, then they'll develop these mental health conditions in the future. So babies are incredibly neurologically dependent on their mother and father, whichever one is their primary caregiver, because to a baby that's just been born, they're taking in so much stimulation, they're taking all these stimuli, and it's overwhelming for them. They're not born ready into this world. Like, if you look at some sort of documentary, giraffe baby would be born, horse baby would be born, they'll be running the same day. But humans are different. We take so much time to develop, and so many important things happen during that time. That 0 to 3 age, that first very key time of like development and neurological growth, or growth of your brain cells, it happens mostly in that time period. In the absence of a loving, caring and present mother or father, the development of people's emotional regulation and brains essentially becomes stunted. Maybe you've seen this with people you know. It is sometimes as though the stimuli of a busy place, a new place, or just things out of routine become overwhelming, because as children they were not given the stability needed to learn how to process these situations, and that their brains never got a chance to fully develop the section that is involved in processing the stimuli in a healthy way. In many parts of the world, and in many cultures outside of Western culture, most children are right with their mothers for the first 3 years of their life. Whether they're doing housework or grocery shopping, they're always just an arm's length away so they can soothe them if they get stressed. According to Erica Commisser, the first year is what forms the attachment, and the next 2 years solidifies this attachment. I can't make a video about mental illness without talking about the brain, and specifically the prefrontal cortex. So there are two critical periods of brain development: 0 to 3 years old and adolescence, which is 9 to 25. Pre-adolescence is 9 to 13 years old, middle adolescence is 14 to 18, and late adolescence is 18 to 25. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision making, reasoning, personality expression, maintaining social appropriateness, and other complex cognitive behaviors, does not finish developing until 25. It wasn't until recently that scientists were able to use technology like fMRIs to understand the way the brain worked, to understand that adolescence usually spans a much longer period than what was once thoughts. It is this prefrontal cortex that helps us regulate us, deal with stress, deal with adversity, and regulate our emotions. And during that very first stage of development, 0 to 3 years old, 85% of a child's right brain cells develop in that time. A lot of disorders we see in children and in adolescents are stress disorders. Take for example ADHD, which is more so a stress response than a disorder according to some experts. It's a flight part of the brain being in fight or flight. And what researchers have noticed is that the last few decades there has been an increase in aggressive behavior and an increased distractibility. And usually these are the first things that parents would hear from a teacher or schools when there is a problem. In many cases, rather than looking at why a child is stressed, parents and also therapists and medical people and teachers, they will just push them to get medicated. And once medicated, and really not dealing with the root of the issue, the parents will just kind of like allow them to be absent of taking any blame. But in reality, this stress response is because of the environment that they're growing in, and something around them is causing to feel this stress. So rather than medicating them, it's important that parents kind of reflect and see how they might be causing some of these conditions to come up. Whenever a child has an issue, more often than not, it is the parents that have an issue. That's probably why there are many studies that have shown that the greater the engagement parents have with therapy, as well as their children, the more positive the outcome. And that therapy appears to be less effective for children's mental health if they are sent back to the same environment that created that illness in the first place. So if both parents were also educated on how to create a better environment for their children and they implemented some strategies, it may reduce stress-related mental illness. But I know what you're asking, what about genetics? Where do genetics fit into this puzzle that is mental illness? When it comes to disease, there is almost always a genetic element at play. This is still true for mental illness. You just have to look at family history. If someone's mom or dad had a condition, then it's likely that they'll have it too. To understand the role that genetics play, we have to look at epigenetics. Even though we're born with certain genes and a certain genetic makeup, it is our environment that turns some of these genes on or off to make us the way that we are. For example, there's a gene for stress sensitivity, there's a gene for schizophrenia, a gene for bipolar disorder, but as of what we know now, there's no gene for depression and anxiety. The genes for sensitivity to stress is a short allele on the serotonin receptor, and we need the normal one to pick up the neurochemical serotonin in our brain so we can feel happiness. Certain kids are born with a short allele, which makes it so that they can't pick up the serotonin, and this, in connection with the lack of empathetic parenting, has shown to lead to mental health issues down the line. If you want to understand how this works in an analogy, think about it as there's something like serotonin, a chemical that makes us feel happy at the top shelf. And your brain cells are basically like little children at the bottom. And they need someone who's tall enough to pick up that happiness hormone and give it to them. But because some people are just born with a shorter version of that, they can't pick up that chemical. That's chemicals out of reach. And because of that, they're more sensitive to negative emotions because they're not able to capture that serotonin molecule and then give that to their own their brain cells to feel happiness. Now, stress is different on girls versus boys. Now, typically for boys, we notice stress in the form of ADHD or just restlessness in schools. If they're not able to sit down and to focus on their studies, then we diagnose them with ADHD, or we say that they have attention issues. But in reality, school is becoming earlier and earlier over the past couple of centuries, and as we're putting very, very young boys into school early when they should be doing rough and tumble play with their parents, with their family members, and just learning the world through, I guess, just breaking things and just what boys normally do, then you're forcing them into a role that they really haven't been evolutionarily designed to do, which is just sit down, focus on one thing and just repeat that all the time, or just listen to authority at a very young age. There's been many studies to show that actually in two periods of development, which is adolescence, which is 9 through to 25, and in very early childhood, 0 to 3, certain boys, they show testosterone levels as high as people do during normal adolescence and teenage years. So these boys, they don't want to sit down and to study. They're physically and hormonally, they don't want to do that. In fact, it's almost feminizing them into a role that they haven't been adapted to or haven't evolved to do. And it's things like this that cause these stress-related disorders in boys, at least according to the experts that I've heard. But the stress response is really different when it comes to girls. For most girls, there's a pressure to be perfect, which is why they tend to be incredibly self-conscious, because of the part of the brain called the amygdala, which is the stress-related part of the brain. It is a little almond-shaped part of the brain, which happens to be the oldest part, which is so connected to the limbic system. And because of the stress we're putting on kids at an early age, there's a greater pressure for girls because they try to be more perfectionistic than boys, because their amygdalas are much more stimulated, because this is the same part of the brain that senses threats, which makes them very aware and very self-conscious about judgment of peers, judgment of teachers, judgment of parents, and increasingly the education system that is putting a lot of academic pressure on them. So if you want to have kids one day, or if you already have kids, you need to keep these things in mind so that you can give your kids the best possible chance to have a childhood that helps them become more mentally resilient and learn how to form healthier relationships with the people they'll meet later in life. It's also important to know what kind of habits might make mental illness worse. The common triggers that make it worse typically are lack of sleep. So not getting quality sleep means that it's harder for your brain to rest and recover and to then process emotions and process the memory, because part of what your brain does when you go to sleep is that it actually goes back over the memories you had that day and it tries to understand them, pick out meanings from them, and then put the important piece of information into long-term storage for you to use. So ensuring that you get adequate sleep, and typically 8 hours every night, is how you can actually improve your mental illness, or at least stop it from getting worse. Also, eating an unhealthy diet full of processed foods and eating takeaway is just going to make your mental illness worse. If you focus on eating healthy whole foods, then it has shown that it can improve mental illness outcomes. And consuming alcohol and taking drugs can make mental illness much worse than it was before. I wasn't really sure how to conclude this video. I wanted to talk about different solutions, but in some cases there really isn't any solution that can completely cure certain conditions. Some conditions can be cured, some conditions can be managed, and it's important for people to be realistic about what can be completely cured and what can be managed. And it's just important to have hope when it comes to these types of things, because even if you can't completely cure a mental illness, then you can at least learn to manage it. And I've just read a lot of different success stories about people who have certain conditions and they were able to manage it better, whether through therapy, whether through having very, very good friends and very good support networks, living very healthy lives and just doing what they enjoy. You can still live a very good life even if you have certain conditions. The main thing I want to end on is that even if you have suffered from things in the past, there's still ways to make your life enjoyable, to increase your quality of life, no matter what kind of mental condition you might have or what kind of thing you might be able to do. So this is both a video for some people with these conditions, and also a video for people who want to be parents one day and also ensure that their kids don't suffer from certain things. If you are going to have some kids one day, then it's very important for you to be wary about how your actions can impact them during their most crucial points of development. And if you do have mental disorders or mental illnesses, that there is hope. There's a lot of help out there. There's a lot of things that can help you to get you to living a life that you'd enjoy. You don't have to keep suffering. You can actually do so much with the right help. And that's just what I wanted to end on.